The Adsonite stood like a statue, his large faceted eyes shimmering with all the colors of the rainbow, bright and meaningless. He did not seem to pay any attention to the various objects and tablets before him, though his antennae, which grew from the sloping forehead above his eyes, twitched slightly. It had been suggested that these twitches might be a sign of intense contemplation, but Sven was ready to swear that the Adsonite was simply sleeping, standing up, or meditating, or praying, mistaking him, Sven, for an unknown deity or demon, and the standard contactor's kit for magical artifacts, the trappings of a supernatural being. There was no way to find out, as the Adsonite stubbornly refused to make contact. The expedition had been working on the planet called Adson's world for a month, and for the last 2 weeks, Sven had been trying to make contact with the local population, all to no avail. It was getting desperate. Sven had been on 5 expeditions already, and never once had he encountered natives so indifferent to visiting alien beings. Hell, he'd prefer to see the Adsonites try to kill him regularly, as the amphibians from Vorian 4 had done, just to avoid banging his head against this wall. That said, the Adsonites were undoubtedly intelligent. Moreover, they had created a unique civilization, unlike anything humans had met. Most of them lived in living cities, huge, beautiful settlements where the dwellings were specially grown trees with big cavities. There were underground farms where various edible plants and local analogs of mushrooms grew, some sort of public buildings of unknown purpose, in which Adsonites gathered by the thousands, making strange sounds. Presumably, it was speech, which, however, even the most powerful linguistic computer of the expedition could not decipher. There was even a unique waste disposal system, small creatures of several types that absorbed any garbage and, in turn, served as an additional food source for the Adsonites. Sven couldn't remember which expedition member had first compared the Adsonites to ants and their city to an anthill, but in any case, the comparison was incorrect. First, the Adsonites were not insects. Biologists have yet to manage to get the body of an Adsonite for dissection, because the corpses of the dead went for processing in the same way as other waste. However, the appearance of the Adsonites was quite humanoid. The only features that related them to insects were huge faceted eyes and antennae above them, similar to the pinnate tendrils of butterflies. In addition, the Adsonites were divided into 2 sexes. They formed nuclear families, although children of a certain age lived in separate dormitories up to when they got families of their own. But the Adsonites ignored all attempts to establish contact. They had very little interest in what was happening outside the living cities and rarely went out. At one time, it seemed that they were interested in the new camp of scientists and regularly visited it to observe people. But in the end, it turned out that, due to ignorance, the camp was set up right on the way from one living city to another. Adsonites traveled very rarely, but when it did happen, and they came across a human camp, they showed a reaction unusual for an intelligent creature. They dumbly hovered in place, looking at the camp bustle, as if hypnotized by the alien life, and after a few hours turned around and went back to the city. To the shame of all scientists, this supposedly mysterious meditation was solved by the expedition's quartermaster, Caleb Suarez, a man as far from science as possible on a research ship. He simply drew a straight line on the map from the city to the camp, continued it, and cleared this continuation of all buildings and objects, and the Adsonites, as if nothing had happened, went straight through the camp, paying no attention to people or equipment and machinery. In a way, it was convenient. To initiate another contact attempt, Sven could simply stand in the path of another Adsonite walker. The aborigine would obediently stop, and the next phase of fruitless search would begin. Sven adjusted the filters in his nostrils and looked at the Adsonite with irritation. For a moment, he even envied the alien's equanimity. Adsonite was living his incomprehensible life and didn't care about anything. No allergies or worries about strange men from the stars. Adson was a planet of flowers and lush vegetation, the advantages of biological civilization. If you adjust to nature and adjust it to yourself without trying to rape it, you end up with a garden planet. Except that for a person with hay fever, this planet suddenly turns out to be a source of torment. No predators, no dangerous microorganisms, the purest air, saturated with floral aromas. And he has to live with plugs in his nose because there are clouds of damn pollen everywhere. Time to let the Adsonite go. It's all useless. Time to let the Adsonite go. It's all useless. Sven began to gather his accessories, and as soon as the way was free, the Adsonite immediately stirred, his antennae stood up straight, and he, as if there was no 2-hour break, walked to Paris, as the expedition members jokingly dubbed one of the nearest living cities. The second city, one of the biggest on the planet, became Beijing. From Beijing to Paris, on foot, in 3 days. It would be funny if it weren't so sad. Sven was determined to convince the head of the expedition, Captain Pokrovsky, to allow him to settle in one of the cities. Of course, this went against all safety rules and psychological principles of contact, but it was clear to Sven that this was the only opportunity he had left. Only if he was among the natives, in their natural habitat, would he have any hope of understanding and chance to establish some semblance of contact. Sven mentally prepared a heartfelt speech in his defense, referencing the experience of the Villas-Boas brothers in South America and Chong Zim on the Sulpician planet. However, such a request must be made in person, and the captain has now left for the South mainland to investigate some unusual volcanic activity. The petition would have to wait until tomorrow. The next day, however, something happened that made Sven's plans meaningless, something that catastrophically disrupted the soporific and monotonous life of the base research camp on a safe, as it seemed to everyone, planet. The deputy head of the geological sector, Shandor Valtos, had disappeared. He worked mainly in the camp, processing data and samples brought in by field staff from all over the planet, and he hardly ever left the perimeter, so his absence was immediately noticed. It was also discovered that the single-seat ATV, for short trips within a few kilometers of the camp, where the density of vegetation allowed, was missing. Shandor was not in contact. His personal sensor had been disabled. However, the ATV's beacon showed the vehicle's location about 30 kilometers east of the camp, away from the known Adsonite settlements. The visual search from the orbit using the powerful optics of the mission's mothership gave nothing. The vegetation was too dense. Nobody has the slightest idea what the hell Shandor could do there. Captain Pokrovsky took a large shuttle and personally went to search for the missing scientist. After several hours of intensive search, they found him 3 clicks away from the ATV, hopelessly bogged in a shallow swamp, in the ruins of an abandoned city of Adsonites, which no one would call a living city now. All the houses, plants in it had long since died and turned into dry wood. More precisely, they found a body badly eaten by feral scavengers. The geologist was dead. The autopsy showed that Shandor died before the scavengers got to him, Pokrovsky said. The cause of death has not yet been determined. So far, nothing seems to indicate that it might be violent. Still, I'm forced to cancel all outside missions and set up a protective perimeter with the passive force field. He held up a hand, reassuring the scientists, and a worried whisper ran through the ranks. I understand your concerns. Everyone has their research program to work on, but the death of an expedition member is a serious issue, and it imposes additional risks on me. Until the clarification of all circumstances, I am forced to resort to emergency security measures. Questions? The people were stunned and silent. Sven waited a moment longer, then raised his hand. Pokrovsky nodded to him. "What do you have, Tomberg?" Sven stood up, feeling awkward in the center of everyone's attention. "What about the Adsonites?" he said. "We happen to be camped right on their road between the cities. A defensive barrier will block their path." The captain was silent for a moment, thinking. "I understand your concern," he repeated at last. "I'm aware of the story about moving the equipment, but we don't have time to move the camp. They'll have to wait a while or go around. I'm sure the natives had nothing to do with Shandor's death, but I can't risk it until we're 100% sure. If that's all, this meeting is adjourned." The captain waited a moment, then said in a lower tone, "Check all the data you've gathered up until today and see if there are any clues. We have to find out what happened." For a few days afterward, the people gradually got used to life in lockdown. Although the camp was spacious enough, it was hard to get used to the idea of not being able to leave the camp at will. At the same time, the Adsonites were also confronting the fact that they could no longer go wherever they wanted. But unlike humans, they were taking it much worse. Or rather, they couldn't take it at all. They simply came to an invisible protective force field, literally poked their foreheads into the elastic barrier, and stopped. After tramping on the place for several hours, the most stubborn stayed at the camp border for almost the whole local day. The natives turned around and left the same way they had come. Sometimes, there were several of them at once, and some in the camp complained that they felt uncomfortable under the gaze of the big dragonfly eyes. Sven noticed that all the walkers were male. The female Adsonites were usually shorter in stature and of a noticeably more subtle build, much like humans, though no particular sex characteristics were visible. The Adsonites did not wear clothing, much to the delight of biologists who could at least visually study the anatomy of the natives. Despite their insectoid appearance, they were not insects, nor could they be called mammals. Although Adsonite women became pregnant and bore children, they had no mammary glands. The processes of conception and nurturing of the young were still a mystery. Most likely, the Earth classification did not apply to the local species. Sven had no doubt that biologists would develop a new one when they thoroughly understood everything. The investigation into the cause of the geologist's death had not yet yielded definite results. Analyses of tissue samples showed that his central nervous system, including the brain, was severely damaged, and it was this damage that eventually caused his death. But what caused it could not yet be established. If it was some kind of toxin, it had already decayed, and it was impossible to reconstruct it from the decay products. If it was some kind of ionizing radiation, its effect was very selective, and, most importantly, what could be the source? The purely biological civilization of the Adsonites, for all its intricacy, was hardly capable of creating something as technologically advanced as an X-ray machine or a laser. Meanwhile, the humans had gradually gotten used to having a few Adsonites hanging around the southern edge of the camp. Even Sven, who at first tried to take advantage of the situation and work with several natives at once, eventually gave up on this idea and started studying the material filmed by automatic probes in the living cities, hoping to find some new keys to the understanding of this strange civilization. Of course, the filming had been done as discreetly as possible to not disturb the natives, although now he doubted that the game was worth the candle. In Sven's opinion, the Adsonites didn't care about anything in the world. If only he had known in advance how everything would turn out, he would have driven a few micro-drones into the holy of holies of the natives, the meeting halls, kindergartens, and maternity hospitals. For now, however, the captain had ordered that all surveillance equipment be returned to the camp until further notice. On the 6th day, Sven glanced at the parking lot. as everyone now called the part of the perimeter where the unlucky walkers congregated, and noticed something unusual was happening there. Instead of the usual loitering, the Adsonites were busy doing some kind of work. When Sven got closer, he saw that they were digging small holes with primitive shovels and planting something in the fresh soil. Sven looked closer and quickly recognized the young house trees that made up the living cities. The shape of their leaves and the characteristic texture and color of their bark were unmistakable. In addition, he noticed that one of the Adsonites looked familiar. It was a tall male with a prominent scar on the left side of his head that went over the faceted eye, causing some of the eye cells to lose their iridescent glow and become cloudy. Sven was ready to swear that this Adsonite had been here yesterday and the day before. The Adsonites were building their camp. Half an hour later, he shared this information with the head of the mission. "That's interesting," Pokrovsky said, looking at the fresh plantation just beyond the invisible defense barrier. "Didn't you tell me not so long ago that the natives are completely devoid of curiosity? It seems you were wrong. I can't explain it any other way than by setting up an observation post. When it comes to extraterrestrial civilization, you should never jump to conclusions," said Sven. "Remember how wrong we were about the Sulpadians. Some of us almost thought they were in a war of extermination and wanted to intervene. We almost nuked the World Festival of Generations. But now I might even agree with you." The captain rubbed his forehead tiredly. "The headache is killing me. Can't sleep for 2 nights, nightmares and crap. We must do something about the investigation or shut down the program. We can't go on like this. Everyone's tired. As for you..." He thought for a moment. "I feel fine," Sven said. "That's not what I mean." The captain smiled. "I'm glad to hear it, though. All the more reason for you to try to compare the map of the dead city where Shandor was found with the schematics of the Adsonite cities we know. You're the best at this. See if you can figure out where the poor guy was trying to get to. Maybe you can find any parallels. If we can figure out where he was going, it might shed some light on why he did it. And keep one eye on these." The captain nodded toward the barrier. "They're not likely to represent any danger to us, but after Shandor, I'd rather not take any chances." Sven spent the rest of the day studying the scans of the various Adsonite cities. The largest, he estimated, had up to 200,000 inhabitants, the smallest about 10,000. The images varied. Some had been taken from orbit, others from the shuttle during long-range sorties, and several surrounding cities, most notably Beijing and Paris, had been especially carefully captured by autonomous and teleoperated drones. In the process, he had become definitively convinced of a startling fact. The Adsonites don't have any infrastructure outside the cities. They had no agriculture, small out-of-town settlements, or even regular transportation or trade links between cities. Only rare solitary walkers trample through barely visible, quickly overgrown paths in the forests and fields. Nothing even remotely resembling roads, and that was doubly surprising. How had Shandor been able to unmistakably determine the direction to the abandoned city of the Adsonites, which, until that moment, none of the humans had any idea about? In addition, he discovered another thing that he had not paid much attention to before. The Adsonite cities, despite their complexity and harmony, were completely different. Of course, due to the fact that the live houses consisted of plants of the same species, they had a certain similarity to each other, but the layout of each city was unique. Some cities were clearly drawn to symmetry, though rather distorted. It could be both central and axial. And some were completely chaotic, at least at first glance. Some cities had strict geometric outlines, usually of a reasonably precise circle, while others were shapeless. Sven found no system in this. It could be a sign of anything, artistic inclinations of the inhabitants, religious symbols of various cults, fashion for different styles of urban architecture. Only the Adsonites knew the answer, but they were obviously not inclined to share the details of their cultural life. Speaking of the natives, Sven glanced at the screen that displayed the image from the camera he'd set up in front of their new bed of arboreal saplings. Most of the Adsonites had disappeared, probably gone home. Only two figures were daubing at the fancy plants. In the twilight, the details were no longer discernible. The Adsonites stood almost out of reach of the camp light, but somehow Sven was sure that one of them was the old acquaintance with the scar. The exo-psychologist wanted to watch another recording, this time a recent video by a drone monitoring Beijing. However, after delving into the video for only 10 minutes, he realized his eyes were slipping from fatigue. Something he had seen was trying to grab his attention, but he resolutely told himself, "It can wait until tomorrow," and went to sleep. It had been a sweltering night. After barely a couple of hours of sleep, Sven woke up feeling short of breath. He got up, drank some water, and changed the filters to a lighter version that offered less protection from anything that might be in the air, but let in a lot more of it. He wouldn't die of allergies before morning, but it would be difficult to sleep without oxygen. He fell into a deep sleep and didn't wake up until morning. Waking up, he felt vaguely uneasy, though he didn't remember his dream. The captain was right. They were all very tired. Sven couldn't wait to get back to work, so without leaving his dome, he had a quick bite of the dinner he had brought from the mess hall yesterday, drank some cold tea from the thermos, and turned on the work terminal. He picked the record on which he had fallen asleep yesterday and began to look through it carefully, trying to catch what scratched his sleepy brain. It was a panorama of Beijing from a bird's-eye view, and as the image got closer, the frame was fixed on one Adsonite who looked a little different from the others. Sven took a closer look. That's right, the Adsonite's arm was severely mangled, and he was also visibly hobbling on one leg. Fell into a hole? Crushed by a fallen tree? There were no dangerous predators on the planet, at least none that could threaten the natives, and no one had ever seen a fight or anything that could be taken for a conflict between the Adsonites. It was surprising, and gave rise to many extraordinary hypotheses. Obviously, the fact that any of the Adsonites could have been injured so seriously at all had caught the exo-psychologist's attention yesterday. Sven continued to follow the maimed native. The Adsonite walked down the winding street and entered a sizable, roofless structure that Sven had long ago dubbed a stadium, for lack of a better name, even though there were no tribunes in it. It was just a large, irregularly circular space bounded by the high walls of the treehouse. Suddenly, Sven was struck by a hunch. He paused the recording and opened the still images of the dead city in which Shandor had been found. The city was rampant with wild vegetation, and the outline was hard to make out, but it was still apparent that Shandor's body had been found in the very center of the very similar-looking stadium. Anticipating bad things, Sven reran the first recording and saw the crippled Adsonite step into the middle of the stadium and stop. Not a minute later, the ground around him stirred, and the scavengers came to the surface one by one, forming a ring around the native. The Adsonite sat down, bowing his head, and a moment later, all the scavengers pounced on him, instantly hiding him under a moving cover of bodies. After a couple of dozen seconds, it was all over. The scavengers scattered in different directions. Some slipped back into their holes, and others made their way out into the city streets through several different entrances of the stadium. Only a damp patch of orange, blood-soaked soil remained where the crippled Adsonite had just sat. Sven stared, mesmerized, for a while, not noticing the image on the screen. Then he jumped up, knocking over his chair, and rushed out of the dome, He must notify the captain immediately. He was greeted by a completely empty, extinct camp. The residential domes, research facilities, the command center, the mess hall, everything was deserted. Sven's gaze wandered to the landing pad. Thank God, both shuttles and small flyers were parked where they should be, and even the ATVs seemed to be in place. So, the people had left on foot. Or had they been kidnapped? No, he thought, it's impossible. The Adsonites had never shown the slightest sign of aggression. In the case of an extraterrestrial civilization, one should never jump to conclusions. Damn. But how could they have gotten into the camp? No living creature could pass through the barrier except those whose genetic code the protective field was tuned to. Sven looked toward the Adsonites' makeshift observation post. The seedlings were in place, but the natives were gone. The vegetation in the area was mussed and broken, and the tracks clearly went deep into the jungle toward Beijing, so the people went that way, just like Shandor. His head was splitting with pain. He must go after them immediately. He must hurry, catch up with everyone. He can't stay here alone. Sven staggered towards the barrier, but realized that he couldn't go anywhere in his condition. His eyes were watering desperately, and the skin on his face and hands itched unbearably. Christ, he'd forgotten to put in the regular filters. Allergy. Sven returned to his dome and, through the tears, with trembling hands, put the mask connected to the emergency tank over his face. The cylinder contained a clean air mixture laced with antihistamines. It was urgent to eliminate the symptoms. There was no time to waste. At the same time, he gave himself an injection of painkiller, and after a minute, he felt much better. To his surprise, along with the allergy symptoms and headache, the frantic desire to catch up with the other people had disappeared. Sven still felt an intense anxiety and desire to save his companions, but he was no longer tempted to chase after them immediately. Something was wrong. Allergies are unpleasant, but they don't affect the psyche. So it must be something else. And why is he suddenly calm? Painkillers and antihistamines can't have neuroleptic effects either, so that leaves... Wait, what does that leave? Air. Sven wasn't breathing filtered air now, but air from the tank. So there was something in the air. As soon as he isolated himself from the environment, the effects stopped. The scientist's inquisitive mind was already tearing itself loose, building one hypothesis after another. But that could wait. First of all, it was necessary to save the people, who, as Sven was now sure, were walking towards an imminent and terrible death. It was about 20 kilometers from Beijing. That meant almost a full day's walk through the local thickets, so he had to make it. Sven picked up the air tank and walked toward the big shuttle on the landing pad. He already knew what he was going to do. "It turns out your allergies saved us all," the captain said with a slight smile. Who would have thought that such a pesky thing as a tendency to allergies could be a lifeline? They were sitting in the captain's quarters aboard the Lavoisier, comfortably seated in soft chairs near a table on which stood a bottle of light Aldebaran wine from the captain's personal supplies. On the large wall screen was an image of the abandoned camp on Adson, a live feed from an automatic camera mounted on the radar mast. The camp was already beginning to slowly overgrow with native vegetation, with the arboreal saplings on the southern edge growing noticeably taller and sprouting lateral shoots. Soon, there would be a new town on the site of the camp, and the new residents. Sven and the captain followed the lone Adsonite as it crossed the abandoned base. "Still, it's more luck than anything else," Sven said. If I hadn't changed my filters to lighter ones overnight, I probably wouldn't have realized what was going on so quickly. And without understanding, I certainly wouldn't have been able to handle 24 people. You were already approaching Beijing when I caught up with you. I have almost nothing to tell you, said the captain thoughtfully. All I remember is that I had a typical nightmare, where you usually have to get somewhere, but you can't because your legs can barely walk. And then I woke up aboard the shuttle, tied up, and with the hell of a headache. Sven blushed. I'm sorry. I didn't know how quickly the pheromones would wear off, so I put power shackles on everyone in case you woke up too early. And the headache is from the sleeping gas. I overdosed a little. I was afraid it wouldn't work. Pokrovsky waved it off. Come on, it's all nonsense. After all, you saved everyone's life. That outscored everything. Now, I understand how you guessed about the external influence, but how did you know it was pheromones? Sven sipped the tart wine and put the glass back on the table. I didn't know that at first. I only realized it was something in the air, something my filters were only partially trapping, pollen, gas, or something else. At that moment, I didn't care about details. The main thing was to save people. I guessed about pheromones later, on the ship, when I dissected the body of an Adsonite killed by the gas. And it changed all our ideas about intelligent life on Adson, the captain said. Sven nodded. It sure did. We were looking in the wrong direction, and my attempts to make contact with the Adsonites. He laughed. Just imagine if some cybernetic intelligent race came to Earth and tried to make contact with our telephones, food processors, and vacuum cleaners. Of course, the analogy isn't entirely accurate, but it's as absurd as our situation on Adson. When it was discovered that the Adsonites have no brain but possess a very complex and advanced olfactory system, all the puzzle pieces fell into place. The captain switched the channel, and a picture of a living city appeared on the screen. Intelligent forests using mindless humanoids as symbiotes to serve them. No one had ever encountered anything even remotely similar until now. No wonder we went down the wrong path from the start. It's a shame it took poor Shandor's death to find a clue. I think the cities, the true intelligent inhabitants of Adson, mistook us for some kind of feral symbiote at first. Apparently, they weren't too interested, but then Shandor was exposed to the pheromones from the dead city. I guess part of the city was still alive, and by some unfortunate coincidence, it was the part responsible for disposing of the defective symbiotes. Some really unlucky wind brought this poisonous cloud that caught the geologist. In the end, we closed the camp with a barrier, and the communication between Beijing and Paris stopped, because the symbiotes can only walk along the pheromone path. They have nothing to make decisions with. In fact, the entire cavity of their head is occupied by one big nose, to put it very primitively. Well, the city, which we called Beijing, decided to dispose of all the defective symbiotes. That is us. The pheromones were too far away for direct exposure. They'd disperse on the way. So they stuck this seedbed right up to the camp, and we took it for an observation post, continued the captain. It was actually their pheromone version of a loudspeaker. It's a good thing that you were exposed to pheromones much less than Shandor, Sven said. The medics are hiding behind their reservations, but it looks like no one's nervous system or brain seems to have been affected. Maybe it's because Shandor was affected by the dead city. I don't know. To be honest, I still sometimes had bad dreams about the disposal of that crippled symbiote. If I'd been too late. All's well that ends well, the captain said, and we should probably thank the manufacturers of your filters. When we get back to Earth, I'll be sure to mention them in my report. That's what quality means. Sven suddenly laughed. After he calmed down and took a breath, he looked at the captain's bewildered face and said, You see, there's a catch, sir. The advertisement and the manual for the filters say that this is a unique development of the manufacturer's company, a new word in making life easier for people prone to allergies. The filters stop only particles the size of plant pollen, something that usually causes allergies, and let in any odors and pheromones. As it said, you'll be able to enjoy the perfume and feelings of your loved ones without sneezing or wiping away tears. The captain stared at him. It means that you— Exactly, sir. If we play by the rules, I should have sued the manufacturer. Sven finished his wine in a gulp. The filters didn't pass through the pheromones because they were defective.